My name is Jack, and for most of my life I believed I was lucky. 14 years of marriage to Melanie, the woman I thought was my soulmate, felt like proof that I'd done something right. But in the last year, things started to shift. It was subtle at first, little things that could have been chalked up to the natural ebb and flow of life. Then it became undeniable. Melanie had been distant, both physically and emotionally. She started staying out later than usual. At first, it was a late night here and there. Work dinners, she said, or catching up with friends she hadn't seen in years. But recently, those nights started bleeding into mornings. She'd come home after 1 a.m., slipping in quietly, thinking I was asleep. I wasn't. I'd lie there, staring at the ceiling, waiting to hear the door creak open, wondering what was keeping her out so late. It wasn't just the late nights, though. There were other signs. One night, as she walked through the door, I noticed she was holding a gorgeous bouquet of roses. They were vibrant, perfectly arranged, and expensive. I hadn't given Melanie flowers in months. The thought stung more than I expected. When I asked her about them, she waved it off with a casual laugh. They were a gift from a colleague, she said. A thank you for helping with a project. Her explanation was plausible enough, but the way she avoided my eyes made it hard to swallow. Then there were the perfumes. Melanie had always had a signature scent, something light and floral that suited her. Recently, she'd switched to something bold and exotic, the kind of fragrance that lingered long after she left a room. It smelled expensive, too, and I knew I hadn't bought it for her. When I asked, she told me it was just something she'd picked up on a whim. But Melanie wasn't the impulsive type, at least not the woman I thought I knew. I tried to push these thoughts aside, to tell myself I was overthinking. After all, relationships change over time. Maybe she was trying to find herself again or exploring things that made her happy. But deep down, a nagging voice kept telling me there was more to it. I just wasn't ready to face what that might be. That night, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I wanted to bridge the distance that had grown between us, to bring Melanie back to me, if only for one evening. I spent hours preparing dinner, a meal I knew she loved. A roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans sautéed with garlic. Nothing extravagant, but enough to remind her of the simple comforts of home. The house smelled inviting, warm, almost nostalgic, and for a moment, I let myself believe it would work. But when the clock struck 8:30 and there was still no sign of her, the optimism began to slip. I sat at the table, the food cooling in front of me, staring at the empty chair across from mine. My appetite disappeared with each passing minute. By the time the door finally creaked open around 9:45, I was sitting in silence, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock. Melanie stepped inside, her heels clicking against the floor, a purse slung over her shoulder. She looked startled to see me sitting there, as if she'd expected to find the house dark and empty. "You're up late," she said, her tone almost accusatory, like I was the one out of place. She set her purse down on the counter and avoided my gaze as she pulled off her coat. "I made dinner," I said simply, my voice calm but deliberate. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting toward the table and the untouched plates. "Oh, Jack, I wish you'd told me. I grabbed something with the team after work. We had a late meeting." Her words were casual, but there was something off about her delivery. Too rehearsed, too smooth. I gestured toward the chair across from me. "Sit down. Let's eat anyway." She hesitated again, her hand lingering on the back of the chair. Finally, she sat, her movements deliberate, like she was bracing herself. I watched her carefully, noting the faint smudge of lipstick at the corner of her mouth, the way her hair was slightly out of place. She looked like she'd been rushing to compose herself before walking through the door. The silence between us was thick as I picked up my fork and took a small bite of the now-cold chicken. Melanie barely touched her food, poking at the mashed potatoes with her fork. Her gaze flickered to the table, the wall, anywhere but at me. Finally, I broke the silence. "Who gave you the flowers, Melanie?" She froze mid-motion, her fork hovering over her plate. For a moment, I thought she might ignore the question altogether. But then she set the fork down carefully and looked at me, her expression neutral. "I told you," she said, her voice light, almost dismissive. "They were from a client at work. Thank you for going above and beyond. It's nothing." Her words were steady, but her body betrayed her. The way she shifted in her seat, the way she couldn't hold my gaze for longer than a second, it was all too telling. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "You've been distant, staying out late, coming home with flowers and expensive perfumes I didn't buy you. And now you want me to believe it's nothing." She let out a small, incredulous laugh, as if I were being ridiculous. "You're exaggerating, Jack. I've just been busy. Work has been hectic lately, and I guess I've been a little stressed. That's all this is." "Stressed?" I repeated, my voice flat. "You don't look stressed, Melanie. You look happy. At least when you're not here." Her expression hardened, a flicker of defensiveness crossing her face. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I see the way you come home after those late nights," I said, my tone sharp now. "You're glowing. You're smiling to yourself. You don't look like someone weighed down by work. You look like someone who's free." Her mouth opened as if to respond, but she closed it again, her lips pressing into a thin line. For a moment, she looked like she might crack, like she might finally tell me the truth. But then her face shifted, her expression closing off. "I don't have to sit here and listen to you accuse me of whatever it is you're thinking," she snapped, pushing her chair back from the table. "I've done nothing wrong." Her sudden outburst didn't shock me. If anything, it confirmed what I'd been feeling all along. She was deflecting, trying to turn the tables on me to avoid answering the questions she knew she couldn't. I stayed seated, my eyes locked on her as she stood there, arms crossed, glaring down at me. "I'm not accusing you of anything, Melanie," I said quietly. "I'm just asking for the truth." She shook her head, her jaw tightening. "You're impossible, Jack. You're always so paranoid, always reading into things that aren't there. Can't you just trust me?" Trust. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to trust her. I wanted to believe her more than anything. But how could I, when every fiber of my being was screaming that something was wrong? "I used to trust you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But now I don't even know who you are anymore." Her eyes flashed with something, guilt, anger, I couldn't tell. For a moment, she looked like she might say something, like she might offer some reassurance to ease the tension hanging between us. But instead, she grabbed her purse from the counter and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" I called after her. "I need air," she shot back without looking at me. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving me alone in the silence of our empty house. I sat there for a long time, staring at the plates of untouched food on the table, the smell of garlic and rosemary still lingering in the air. My mind was racing, but one thought stood out above the rest. I wasn't done digging. Not yet. Melanie's behavior had me on edge, but I couldn't bring myself to act without proof. As much as I hated the idea, I needed confirmation. Something undeniable, something she couldn't twist or explain away. The opportunity came one evening when she left her phone on the couch. It was an unusual mistake. Melanie was careful, almost meticulous about keeping her phone close. She never left it unattended, always slipping it into her purse or tucking it into her pocket. But that night, for whatever reason, she forgot. Maybe she thought I wouldn't notice. Maybe she was too distracted. It sat there like a challenge, the screen dark and unassuming, but I couldn't ignore the weight of it. After she'd gone to bed, I sat in the living room, staring at the device, my heart pounding in my chest. Every rational part of me screamed not to do it, that it was an invasion of her privacy, but another voice, the one that had been whispering in my ear for months, urged me forward. Taking a deep breath, I picked it up and swiped the screen. The lock screen greeted me with an image of us from years ago, smiling on a beach vacation. The picture felt like a cruel joke now, a relic from a time when I thought everything was fine. I tried her usual passcode, the one she'd used for years, and it worked. A strange mix of relief and dread washed over me as the screen unlocked. Her phone was a window into her life, One she'd clearly kept hidden from me. I started with her photo gallery, my hands shaking as I scrolled through the thumbnails. Most of it seemed normal, pictures of our family, snapshots from her day, but then I saw them. A folder labeled Favorites. My thumb hovered over it for a moment before tapping. Inside were photos of Melanie I didn't recognize. She was dressed in outfits I'd never seen, posing in places I'd never been. There were shots of her at expensive restaurants, the kind we hadn't visited in years. A few were taken in what looked like hotel rooms, luxurious, modern spaces with dim lighting and crisp white sheets. And then there were the selfies. Her smile was different in those, softer, more intimate. But it was the photos that included someone else that made my stomach churn. A man. He wasn't in every picture, but the ones where he appeared told me everything I needed to know. His arm was draped around her shoulders in one. In another, he leaned in close as she laughed at something out of frame. I felt sick. It wasn't just the photos. It was the messages, too. A string of texts between Melanie and someone named Brian. At first, they seemed harmless. Inside jokes, casual exchanges about plans. But as I scrolled further, the tone changed. Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you. I'm counting down the days until our next getaway. I need you. You looked so beautiful tonight. I wish I could wake up next to you. Each message was like a dagger, cutting deeper than the last. I wanted to stop reading, to put the phone down and walk away, but I couldn't. I kept scrolling, piecing together their story. They'd been seeing each other for over 8 months. 8 months of lies, sneaking around, and betrayal. I clenched the phone tightly, my knuckles white as I fought to steady my breathing. My mind raced, a chaotic storm of anger, disbelief, and heartbreak. How could she do this? How could she look me in the eye every day and pretend nothing was wrong? The ground felt like it was giving way beneath me, the life I thought I knew crumbling into nothing. But even as the emotions threatened to overwhelm me, I knew I couldn't let them. Not yet. I forced myself to calm down, to think rationally. Confronting her now, in the heat of the moment, would only lead to more lies, more excuses. No, I needed to be smarter than that. I needed to gather everything, the messages, the photos, the evidence. If she was going to destroy our marriage, she wasn't going to walk away without facing the truth. I forwarded the messages and photos to my own phone, making sure to leave no trace of what I'd done. Then I locked her phone and set it back on the couch, exactly where I'd found it. As I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, my legs felt heavy, like I was dragging the weight of the world behind me. When I opened the door, Melanie was asleep, her breathing soft and even. She looked peaceful, innocent, like someone who had nothing to hide. I stood there for a long time, watching her, my chest tight with a mix of rage and sorrow. Part of me wanted to wake her up, to demand answers, to scream and cry and let her see the damage she'd done. But I didn't. Instead, I slipped into bed beside her, my back to her as I stared into the darkness. My mind was already working, piecing together what my next move would be. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The morning after my discovery was surreal. I went through the motions of making breakfast, helping the kids pack for school, and exchanging pleasantries with Melanie as though nothing had changed. On the surface, it was just another day in our household. But beneath it all, a storm was brewing. I had a plan now, and it was set in motion. After the kids left for school, I made a call to my sister. Without going into details, I told her I needed her to take the kids for the weekend. It's just something Melanie and I need to work through, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She didn't press for answers, just assured me she'd pick them up after school. The weight of what I was about to do settled on me as the day dragged on. By the time Melanie came home, I had everything prepared. She looked surprised to see me waiting in the living room, but I kept my expression neutral. I sent the kids to stay with my sister for the night, I said simply. Her brow furrowed. Why? What's going on? We need to talk, I said, and I don't want them here for this. Her expression shifted. Confusion mingled with unease. She didn't argue, though. I stood and gestured toward the dining table, where I'd set 2 plates and a bottle of wine. Sit down, I said. She hesitated but complied, her movements slow and cautious, like she was trying to gauge my mood. I poured us each a glass of wine, then sat across from her, my hands folded on the table. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension in the room was palpable, heavy and suffocating. Melanie sipped her wine, her eyes darting to me and then away again. "What's this about, Jack?" she asked finally, her tone tinged with impatience. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Setting it on the table between us, I slid it toward her. "You tell me." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't pick up the phone. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb, Melanie," I said, my voice cold. "I went through your phone last night. I saw the messages. I saw the photos. I know about Brian." The color drained from her face, her hand tightening around the stem of her wineglass. You went through my phone?" she stammered, her voice rising. "That's what you're focusing on?" I said, letting out a bitter laugh. "Not the fact that you've been lying to me for months? Not the fact that you've been seeing another man behind my back?" Her jaw tightened, and she set the glass down with a sharp clink. "This is ridiculous, Jack. Brian is just a friend." "A friend?" I repeated, my voice laced with sarcasm. "A friend who sends you messages about last night being amazing? A friend who tells you he wishes he could wake up next to you. That's not what you think?" she said quickly, her words tumbling over each other. "Brian and we've been working closely on a project. Sometimes we go out to celebrate finishing a deal or—" "Stop," I interrupted, leaning forward. "Don't insult my intelligence, Melanie. I've seen the photos. I've seen you two at those restaurants, those hotels. I know how long this has been going on." Her expression hardened. "You're overreacting, Jack. You've always been insecure, always looking for something to be wrong. Maybe if you spent more time focusing on us instead of doubting me, we wouldn't be in this situation." Her words hit like a slap, but I refused to let them derail me. Without a word, I opened the folder on my phone and slid it back to her. "Look at this," I said, my voice low and steady. She hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up the phone. Her eyes scanned the screen, and for the first time I saw the facade crack. The confidence, the defiance. It all evaporated as she scrolled through the evidence. "Still think I'm overreacting?" I asked. She swallowed hard, setting the phone down. "It's not what it looks like, Jack. Those photos, they're out of context. Brian and Don't," I snapped, cutting her off. "Don't you dare try to spin this. You've been lying to me for 8 months, Melanie. 8 months of sneaking around, of betraying me, of making a mockery of our marriage." She shook her head, her voice trembling now. "It wasn't like that. I never meant to hurt you." "Never meant to hurt me?" I repeated, laughing bitterly. "Do you think that makes it better? That knowing you didn't care enough to even think about how this would affect me somehow makes it okay?" She opened her mouth to respond, but I wasn't finished. Reaching into my pocket again, I pulled out one last photo, the one that had shattered any lingering illusions I might have had. It was a shot of her and Brian, their lips locked in a passionate kiss outside the hotel room where we'd celebrated our anniversary years ago. I placed it on the table, sliding it toward her. "Explain this," I said, my voice deadly calm. Her eyes widened as she stared at the photo, her hand flying to her mouth. For a long moment, she said nothing, her face pale and stricken. "Jack, Don't," I said, standing abruptly. "Don't even try. I've heard enough." She reached for me, but I stepped back, out of her reach. "You've destroyed everything, Melanie. Everything we built, everything I thought we had. And for what? For him." Tears filled her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. The weight of her betrayal was too heavy, and I was too angry, too broken to care. "This marriage is over," I said, my voice final. "You made sure of that." I turned and walked away, leaving her sitting at the table, tears streaming down her face as the consequences of her actions finally began to sink in. The silence in the room after my words was deafening. I stood there, staring at Melanie as she sat frozen at the table, her face pale and tear-streaked. For a moment, it looked like she was struggling to process what I had said, like she hadn't fully grasped the gravity of her situation. "Pack your things, Melanie," I repeated, my voice cold and unrelenting. "You're leaving this house. You'll never see the kids again. I'm filing for full custody." Her head snapped up, and her eyes widened in panic. "Jack, no," she choked out, her voice trembling. "You don't mean that. Please, don't do this." But I meant every word. The woman sitting before me wasn't the same woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. She wasn't the woman I had built a life with, shared dreams with, or raised children with. This woman was a stranger who had systematically dismantled everything we had built together, piece by piece, for the sake of her own selfish desires. "You made your choices, Melanie," I said, crossing my arms as I leaned against the wall. "And now you're going to live with the consequences." Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she shook her head vehemently. "Jack, please. It was a mistake. A horrible, stupid mistake. I love you. I love the kids. Don't do this. Don't take them away from me." Her words might have meant something if they had come months ago, before the lies, the late nights, and the damning evidence I now held. But now, they were just empty pleas, meaningless in the face of what she had done. I let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh and unfamiliar even to my own ears. "You love me?" I asked, shaking my head. "Don't insult me, Melanie. If you loved me, you wouldn't have spent the last 8 months sneaking around with him. You wouldn't have lied to my face every single day. You wouldn't have risked everything we had for whatever this was." Her sobs grew louder, and she got up from the table, moving toward me. "Jack, please listen to me. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, but we can fix this. We can go to therapy, talk to someone. Anything, just don't do this to the kids. Don't tear this family apart." I stepped back as she tried to reach for me, her desperation palpable. "No, Melanie," I said firmly, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "You already tore this family apart. You did that the moment you decided I wasn't enough for you." Her hands dropped to her sides, and she crumpled onto the floor, her sobs echoing in the room. "I was stupid, Jack," she cried. "I wasn't thinking straight. It didn't mean anything. I swear. I was lonely, and I made a mistake. But it's you I love. It's always been you." Her words were like salt in a wound, reopening every cut her betrayal had left behind. I stared at her, the woman who was once my everything, now reduced to this. I wanted to feel something. Anger, pity, sadness, but I felt nothing. She had drained me of everything. "You don't get to rewrite the story now, Melanie," I said, my voice cold and detached. "You had months to think about what you were doing, months to stop yourself. But you didn't. You made a choice over and over again, and now you're going to live with it." She looked up at me, her eyes red and pleading. "But what about the kids, Jack? Don't take them away from me. They need their mother." I let out a bitter sigh. "And what kind of example are you setting for them, Melanie? That it's okay to lie and cheat? That it's okay to throw away your family for a fling?" She shook her head, her sobs breaking into gasps. "I made a mistake," she whispered, barely able to speak through her tears. "Please, Jack, I'll do anything. Just don't take them from me. Don't take my family." Her words might have moved me once, but now they were just noise, a desperate attempt to cling to the life she had destroyed. "I'm done, Melanie," I said, turning away from her. "I'll have the papers drawn up by the end of the week. You'll get to explain to the court why you don't deserve custody. And when the kids ask why their family fell apart, you'll get to explain that, too." I heard her cry out behind me, a sound of pure anguish, but I didn't turn back. I walked upstairs and shut the bedroom door behind me, blocking out her sobs as I sat on the edge of the bed. For the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself breathe. The weight of her betrayal still hung over me, but it was no longer suffocating. I had made my decision, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was in control. Melanie was right about one thing: the kids deserved better. They deserved a parent who put them first, who loved them enough not to tear their family apart. And I would make sure they had that, even if I had to do it alone. The anger I thought I'd exhausted in my confrontation with Melanie reignited the next morning. It wasn't just the betrayal that ate at me, it was the audacity. Even after being caught, she still had the nerve to plead for another chance, to deny what was obvious, to beg for the family she'd torn apart. I couldn't let it end like that. She needed to understand what she had done, fully and without the safety net of lies. That's when the opportunity fell into my lap. A series of messages from Brian popped up on her phone while it sat unattended on the kitchen counter. I was careful as I picked it up, not leaving any sign I'd been snooping. The conversation was sickeningly familiar now. The same inside jokes, flirtatious comments, and plans to meet that I'd seen before. But it was the latest exchange that caught my attention. Brian, can't wait for tomorrow night. Same place as last time. Melanie, yes, rooms booked under my name. 8 p.m. I'll make it worth the wait. I read the messages twice, my stomach churning. They were planning to meet at a fancy hotel downtown. The same hotel where some of their previous photos had been taken. The betrayal felt fresh all over again. But this time it wasn't going to end with a passive discovery. This time I would take control. That evening, after Melanie had gone out to run errands, I made my own arrangements. I called the hotel and reserved a room directly next to theirs. It was a simple enough task, thanks to her lack of subtlety in using her own name for the booking. Everything was falling into place, but this wasn't just about catching her in the act. I wanted proof. Undeniable, inescapable proof. The next day passed agonizingly slowly. Melanie acted like everything was normal, humming to herself as she got ready for her evening with friends. I didn't say a word about it, letting her think she was as clever as ever. When she kissed me on the cheek before heading out, I had to fight every instinct not to flinch. As soon as her car pulled out of the driveway, I grabbed my bag and headed for the hotel. I arrived an hour before they were scheduled to meet, checking into my room and setting up the hidden camera I'd purchased earlier that day. It was small, discreet, and easy to position through the adjoining door's peephole, giving me a clear view of their room. The setup was seamless, and by the time the clock struck 8 p.m., I was sitting in the dark, watching the live feed on my laptop. Melanie arrived first. She was dressed in a sleek black dress I hadn't seen before, her hair styled in loose waves that framed her face perfectly. She looked radiant, but not for me. She paced the room for a few minutes, checking her phone and adjusting her dress in the mirror. Then came the knock. Brian stepped into the room, all confident smirks and casual charm. He leaned in and kissed her without hesitation, his hands finding her waist as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Watching it unfold through the camera felt like being hit by a freight train. Even though I'd known what to expect, seeing it happen was a different kind of pain. They laughed, clinked glasses of champagne, and sat close on the edge of the bed. The intimacy between them was undeniable. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I didn't need to. Their body language told me everything. My hands shook as I typed out the message I'd been rehearsing in my head all day. Me, are you enjoying yourself? Now I know everything. Through the camera, I saw her phone buzz on the nightstand. Melanie glanced at it, her expression shifting from carefree to tense in an instant. She picked it up, her eyes scanning the screen, and then froze. Brian noticed her change in demeanor and leaned over to look at the phone. His face hardened, and he muttered something I couldn't make out. Melanie stood abruptly, her movements jerky, and began pacing the room. She typed something on her phone, but I didn't bother waiting for her response. Instead, I typed another message. Me, don't bother lying. I'm in the room next door. Smile for the camera. The reaction was immediate. Melanie's head whipped toward the adjoining door, her eyes wide with panic. Brian followed her gaze, standing now, his posture defensive. For a moment, they both just stared at the door, as if expecting me to burst through it. But I didn't. I stayed in my room, watching as the reality of their situation sank in. Melanie began speaking rapidly, gesturing toward the door, but Brian shook his head and grabbed his coat. He stormed out of the room without so much as a backward glance, leaving Melanie alone. She stood there for a moment, looking at the door, then at her phone and finally at the hidden camera. When she spoke, I could see her lips form the words, "Jack, please." I closed the laptop, cutting off the feed. There was nothing left to see. I packed my things quickly, making sure I left no trace behind, and left the hotel before Melanie could gather the courage to confront me. By the time I got home, I'd blocked her number and filed the footage away in a secure folder. This wasn't just about exposing her anymore. This was about closing the chapter on a marriage that no longer existed. Whatever came next, I was ready for it. She had made her choices, and now it was my turn to make mine. When I stepped into the hallway outside my hotel room, the air felt electric. I could hear the soft ding of the elevator at the end of the corridor and rushed toward it. Sure enough, there they were, Melanie and Brian. He was standing stiffly with his hands in his pockets, his face twisted in a scowl. Melanie looked panicked. Her arms crossed over her chest as if trying to shrink into herself. "Jack?" she stammered when she saw me. Brian turned, his posture shifting from indifference to something more defensive. He didn't say anything, but his eyes flicked between me and Melanie, clearly trying to assess the situation. "Get in the car," I said, my voice low and steady. "Jack, please let's just—" I said, "Get in the car," I interrupted, my tone brooking no argument. Melanie froze, and for a moment, it looked like she might refuse. But then Brian muttered, "We should just go. Let's get this over with." His voice was quieter than I expected, no longer carrying the smug confidence I'd seen through the camera. Without another word, I turned and headed for the parking lot. I didn't check to see if they were following me. I could hear their hesitant footsteps behind me, dragging like weights. When we reached the car, I opened the back door and motioned for them to get inside. The ride was silent except for the hum of the engine. I could see Melanie fidgeting nervously in the rearview mirror, her fingers twisting together in her lap. Brian sat rigidly next to her, staring out the window, his jaw clenched. We drove out of the city, the familiar landmarks of our suburban life giving way to empty roads and overgrown fields. My destination was deliberate, a crumbling old building on the outskirts of town. It was a place Melanie and I had spent countless evenings in our younger days, back when everything was simpler, and the idea of betrayal felt impossible. When I pulled into the gravel lot and cut the engine, neither of them moved. "Out," I said. They stepped out of the car reluctantly, their movements slow and unsure. I led them inside, the echo of our footsteps bouncing off the cracked walls and broken windows. The building smelled of damp earth and decay, a fitting backdrop for what was about to unfold. We stopped in what used to be the main hall, a wide-open space with graffiti-covered walls and a few rusted chairs scattered around. I turned to face them, the weight of my anger and betrayal heavy in the air between us. "Start talking," I said, my voice cold. "I want the truth, Melanie. All of it." She hesitated, her eyes darting to Brian as if hoping he'd intervene. But he didn't. He just stood there, pale and silent, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Jack," she began, her voice trembling, "I never meant for this to happen." "Don't give me that," I snapped. "You don't accidentally cheat on your husband for 8 months. You made a choice, Melanie. Now tell me why." She flinched at the sharpness of my words, tears welling in her eyes. I was bored. Okay? Is that what you want to hear?" "Bored?" I repeated, my tone laced with disbelief. "Yes," she cried, her voice rising. "Our life became so predictable, Jack. Every day was the same routines, the same conversations, the same everything. I felt like I was suffocating, like I was stuck in a loop. And then Brian came along." Her voice trailed off as she glanced at him, but he didn't meet her eyes. "He made me feel alive again," she continued, her words spilling out in a rush. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. I just wanted to feel something different." I stared at her, my chest tight with a mix of rage and heartbreak. "So you decided to destroy everything we built for a few cheap thrills?" Her tears fell freely now, but she didn't answer. I turned my attention to Brian, who had been standing there like a statue. "And you?" I said, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. "What's your excuse? What makes you think you have the right to come into my life and tear it apart?" He swallowed hard, his face pale as he finally looked at me. I didn't think it would get this far," he muttered. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone." I let out a bitter laugh. "Didn't mean to hurt anyone? Is that supposed to make me feel better? You've been sneaking around with my wife for months. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences?" Brian opened his mouth to respond but thought better of it and fell silent again. I turned back to Melanie, my voice trembling with barely contained emotion. "Do you even realize what you've done? What you've taken from me? From the kids? You didn't just hurt me, Melanie. You destroyed our family. For what?" She collapsed onto one of the rusted chairs, burying her face in her hands as sobs racked her body. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for it to get this far. I didn't want to lose you or the kids. I made a mistake." "A mistake?" I repeated bitterly. "One mistake is forgetting an anniversary. One mistake is burning dinner. You didn't make a mistake, Melanie. You made a choice. Over and over again." Her cries grew louder, but I felt nothing. No pity, no sympathy, no love. Just emptiness. I looked at Brian one last time, my gaze hard and unyielding. "You can have her," I said, my voice low. "Because after tonight, she's nothing to me." With that, I turned and walked out of the building, leaving them both behind in the cold, empty space where our love had once thrived. As Melanie sat crumpled in the cold, abandoned building and Brian stood stiffly in the corner, I let the silence stretch out. It was heavy, suffocating, and full of finality. They needed to understand there was no coming back from this. "Tomorrow," I began, my voice low but firm, "you will disappear from our lives, Melanie. You will no longer be allowed to see the children. I'm filing for divorce and full custody." Her head snapped up, her tear-streaked face twisting in anguish. "Jack, no. You can't. Please don't do this. Don't take the kids from me." "I can," I said, my tone unwavering. "And I will. Do you think I want them to grow up with this? To know that their mother threw away her family for someone like him?" I gestured sharply toward Brian, who flinched but said nothing. "They deserve better, Melanie. They deserve stability. And I'll make damn sure they get it." Her sobs filled the room, but they didn't move me. Her tears weren't for the family she destroyed. They were for herself, for the consequences she now had to face. Then I turned to Brian, my gaze icy. "As for you," he stiffened, his hands twitching at his sides like he was ready to run. "Look, man, I didn't mean." "Shut up," I snapped, cutting him off. "I don't want your excuses. You've already said enough. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to stay away from my family. Permanently. If I ever see your face near my house, my kids, or anywhere in our lives again, I swear I will make your life unbearable." His face went pale, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to find the right words. But he didn't argue. He simply nodded, his eyes darting nervously to Melanie, who was still crying softly. "Get out," I said, my voice flat. They hesitated for a moment, exchanging a look that might have been regret or relief. I didn't care which. Then they walked past me toward the door, their steps slow and hesitant, as if they were waiting for me to call them back. I didn't. I followed them out of the building, stopping short of the car as they climbed into Brian's vehicle. He started the engine, and without another word, they drove off into the night. I stayed there for a long time, leaning against my car, the cool metal grounding me as my thoughts swirled. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unravel. The woman I'd loved, trusted, and built a life with was gone, replaced by a stranger I didn't recognize. The pain was sharp and unrelenting, but beneath it was something else, a faint glimmer of clarity. This was a painful step, but it was necessary. I couldn't keep holding on to a relationship built on lies and betrayal. I couldn't let my children grow up in a house poisoned by mistrust and resentment. When I finally got back into the car, I sat there in silence, staring at the steering wheel. Memories of our life together flooded my mind. Our wedding day, the birth of our kids, the vacations and quiet evenings that once seemed so full of promise. Those memories felt hollow now, like echoes of a life I could never get back. But then I thought of my children, their laughter, their innocence, their unwavering trust in me. They were my anchor, my reason to move forward. I started the car and headed home, the road stretching out before me like a blank slate. My path was clear now. I would rebuild my life, not for Melanie or the marriage we had lost, but for my children. They deserved a future free from lies, a future where they could grow up knowing they were loved and valued. As I pulled into the driveway, the house seemed quieter than usual. Empty, but not in a way that felt sad. It felt like a new beginning, a chance to start fresh and create a life that wasn't weighed down by the mistakes of the past. I sat in the car for a moment longer, letting the weight of the night settle. Then I stepped out, closed the door behind me, and walked into the house. My children were my priority now. They were my hope, my strength, and my future, and I would do everything in my power to protect them.